She's on your mind every single day, but your phone stays silent. No missed calls, no messages, just thoughts that won't leave you alone. And the question that hurts the most is not why she doesn't call, it's why you still care. Emotional attachment often disguises itself as love, especially when emotions are intense and persistent. When someone occupies your thoughts constantly, the mind convinces you that this depth of feeling must mean something profound. But attachment is not created by mutual understanding or shared effort. It is created by repetition, fantasy, and unmet emotional needs. You don't fall into attachment because someone gives you clarity. You fall into it because your mind keeps returning to the same unanswered questions. The more uncertain the connection, the more the brain tries to resolve it, replaying moments, imagined conversations, and possible futures. This mental loop feels like love, but it is actually your nervous system seeking emotional closure. Love is rooted in presence, consistency, and reciprocity. Attachment, on the other hand, can grow even in absence. It feeds on emotional hunger rather than emotional nourishment. When a woman is always on your mind but never calls, your feelings are not being reinforced by her actions. They are being reinforced by your own thoughts. That distinction is critical. Your emotions are self-generated, not co-created. The intensity you feel is real, but the source of that intensity is internal. It comes from hope, expectation, and the desire to be chosen, not from a shared emotional reality. Attachment also thrives where boundaries are weak. When you emotionally invest without feedback, you begin to assign meaning where none has been given. You interpret silence as mystery, distance as depth, and unavailability as complexity. This is not because the other person is extraordinary, but because your emotional energy has nowhere else to go. The mind fills the gap by idealizing the person, turning them into a symbol rather than a partner. You are no longer responding to who they are, but to what they represent: validation, comfort, or the promise of connection. Another reason attachment feels so convincing is because it creates identity. You begin to see yourself as the one who cares more, waits longer, understands deeper. That role becomes familiar, even comforting, despite the pain it causes. Letting go of attachment then feels like losing a part of yourself, not just losing a person. But love does not require self-erasure. It does not demand that you stay emotionally loyal to someone who is emotionally absent. Love expands you. Attachment confines you to longing. When attachment is mistaken for love, people often tolerate emotional imbalance. They excuse lack of effort, justify silence, and minimize their own needs. The focus shifts from how does this relationship feel to how do I keep this feeling alive? That is when attachment becomes self-sacrificing rather than self-respecting. You begin to believe that thinking about someone constantly is proof of connection, even when there is no communication, no initiative, no emotional presence from the other side, and your mind continues to stay occupied, not because the bond is strong, but because it is unresolved, because uncertainty keeps pulling your attention back, because what is unavailable often feels more valuable than what is freely given, because the brain confuses intensity with importance and longing with meaning. And as long as that confusion remains, attachment will continue to feel like love, even when it is quietly draining you from the inside. Silence is often misunderstood as absence, as emptiness, as something neutral that simply exists when words are missing. But silence is never empty. It always carries meaning, especially in emotional relationships. When someone consistently chooses not to call, not to respond, not to initiate, that choice itself becomes a message. Human beings communicate not only through words, but through patterns, priorities, and behavior. Silence is not confusion. Silence is clarity without explanation. It tells you where you stand without ever needing to say it out loud. Many people struggle to accept silence because they are trained to look for verbal answers. They wait for closure, for reasons, for conversations that will finally make things make sense. But silence already answered the question they are afraid to face. When someone values you, effort appears naturally. When someone is emotionally available, presence becomes consistent. When none of that happens, the silence is not accidental. It is deliberate, even if unconsciously so. It reflects where you fall on their list of emotional priorities. What makes silence so powerful is that it shifts responsibility onto the person who is waiting. You begin to analyze yourself instead of the situation. You wonder if you said something wrong, if you should have waited longer, if you should reach out one more time. Silence creates self-doubt because it removes feedback. And in the absence of feedback, the mind turns inward, often blaming itself. This is how silence quietly erodes self-worth while appearing harmless on the surface. Silence also creates an illusion of depth. When there are no words, the mind fills the space with interpretation. You imagine hidden feelings, unspoken struggles, or emotional complexity that explains the distance. But more often than not, silence is simple. It is not a puzzle meant to be solved. It is a boundary being drawn without confrontation. Some people choose silence because it allows them to avoid responsibility, avoid honesty, and avoid emotional accountability while still keeping the door slightly open. There is also a painful asymmetry in silence. The one who stays quiet often feels powerful, while the one waiting feels powerless. The waiting person pauses their life, their emotions suspended, while the silent person continues uninterrupted. This imbalance is not love, and it is not mutual interest. It is emotional inequality. Silence maintains control because it forces the other person to stay attentive, hopeful, and emotionally invested without receiving anything in return. Understanding silence requires emotional maturity. It means accepting actions over intentions, patterns over promises, reality over potential. Silence does not mean try harder. It does not mean wait longer. It does not mean prove your worth. It means the connection is not being chosen. And once you recognize silence as communication, you stop chasing explanations and start listening to what is already being shown. Because clarity does not always come through words. Sometimes it arrives through the consistent absence of them, through unanswered calls, through days that turn into weeks, through the quiet realization that if someone wanted to reach out, they already would have. Longing often feels deeper and more intense than real connection because it is fueled by absence rather than reality. When something is unavailable, the mind magnifies its importance. What you cannot access easily becomes mentally elevated, not because it is better, but because it is incomplete. Longing thrives in the space between what is desired and what is withheld. That gap creates tension, and tension creates emotional intensity. Connection, on the other hand, is stable. It is grounded. It does not keep the nervous system alert. And because the human brain is more reactive to uncertainty than to safety, longing can feel more powerful than actual intimacy. When there is no consistent contact, the imagination takes over. You begin to construct an emotional narrative using fragments, a look, a memory, a brief conversation. These fragments are replayed repeatedly until they feel larger than life. The person becomes an idea rather than a reality. In this state, you are not relating to who they truly are, but to who you believe they could be. The mind fills in the missing details with hope, fantasy, and expectation. This imagined version is often more compelling than a real person because it is not limited by flaws, effort, or responsibility. Longing is also addictive because it keeps you emotionally engaged without requiring mutual participation. There is no risk of conflict, disappointment, or rejection in fantasy. The relationship exists safely in your mind where it can be controlled, revisited, and idealized. Real connection demands vulnerability, communication, and reciprocity. Longing demands only patience and emotional endurance. For many people, especially those who have learned to associate love with struggle, longing feels familiar and therefore comforting even when it is painful. Another reason longing feels stronger is because it activates desire, not fulfillment. Desire is restless. It keeps you focused on what is missing rather than what is present. Fulfillment is quiet. It does not demand constant attention. The emotional high of longing comes from anticipation, from imagining what could happen if things changed. But anticipation without movement becomes stagnation. The longer the longing lasts, the more emotionally invested you become, not because the bond is growing, but because the hope is being extended. Longing also distorts perception. You begin to overvalue small signs and undervalue consistent absence. A delayed reply feels meaningful. A rare moment of attention feels significant. The emotional system becomes conditioned to scarcity, and scarcity increases perceived value. This is why emotionally unavailable connections can feel so consuming. They offer just enough stimulation to keep you attached, but not enough stability to create peace. True connection does not keep you in suspense. It does not rely on guessing, waiting, or interpreting silence. It is felt in consistency, effort, and emotional availability. But when longing replaces connection, the emotional experience becomes intense yet ungrounded, powerful yet fragile, because it is sustained not by shared reality, but by unmet desire, unresolved hope, and the continuous emotional pull of something that remains just out of reach, keeping your heart engaged while your needs remain unfulfilled, your attention fixed on absence rather than presence, and your emotional energy tied to something that never fully arrives. Emotional distance becomes dangerous the moment it is mistaken for depth. When someone is inconsistent, unavailable, or distant, the mind often interprets that distance as mystery, complexity, or emotional intensity. Instead of seeing the lack of effort for what it is, you begin to romanticize it. You tell yourself that meaningful connections are supposed to be difficult, that love requires patience, and that emotional struggle is a sign of something real. This belief quietly rewires how you understand intimacy, turning absence into attraction and inconsistency into excitement. Romanticizing emotional distance often begins with the idea that if something is hard to get, it must be valuable. The less someone gives, the more attention they receive. Their unpredictability keeps you alert, emotionally invested, and constantly interpreting signs. You wait for moments of closeness, like rewards, and those brief moments feel amplified because they break long periods of silence. This pattern trains your emotional system to associate love with emotional highs and lows rather than stability and safety. The real danger lies in how this dynamic shifts your standards. You start lowering your expectations, convincing yourself that basic effort is too much to ask for. A simple message feels significant. Minimal attention feels meaningful. You begin to feel grateful for crumbs while ignoring the fact that your emotional needs remain unmet. Over time, this erodes self-respect because you are adapting yourself to someone else's emotional limitations instead of questioning why the connection requires so much emotional sacrifice from only one side. Romanticized distance also creates an imbalance of power. The emotionally distant person controls the pace, the access, and the emotional temperature of the connection. You are left waiting, adjusting, and hoping while they remain detached and unaffected. This imbalance is often mistaken for passion, but in reality, it is emotional inequality. One person is deeply invested while the other remains comfortably distant. The more you chase closeness, the more the distance defines the relationship. Another subtle danger is that emotional distance allows people to avoid accountability. When someone is distant, they are rarely required to explain themselves, clarify intentions, or show up consistently. The lack of clarity becomes normalized. You stop asking direct questions because you are afraid of pushing them further away. Silence replaces honesty, and uncertainty replaces commitment. What feels like emotional depth is often just emotional avoidance dressed up as complexity. Over time, romanticizing emotional distance disconnects you from your own emotional truth. You ignore discomfort, rationalize confusion, and suppress your need for reassurance and consistency. You begin to believe that wanting clarity makes you needy, that asking for effort makes you demanding. This belief system keeps you stuck in relationships where emotional fulfillment is always postponed. And as long as distance is seen as romantic rather than revealing, the cycle continues, drawing you deeper into longing, self-doubt, and emotional imbalance, where love feels intense but never secure, meaningful but never mutual, and powerful yet quietly exhausting from within. Self-respect is one of the most powerful forces in any relationship, even if it is invisible at first. When someone is consistently distant or unavailable, maintaining your own sense of worth can completely shift the balance of emotional power. Most people underestimate the impact of self-respect because they confuse it with pride or stubbornness. True self-respect is not about being cold or punitive. It is about understanding your value, honoring your needs, and refusing to sacrifice your emotional well-being for the sake of someone else's inconsistency. When you start prioritizing your own emotional health, everything changes. You stop reacting to absence with anxiety and start responding with clarity and calmness. You are no longer at the mercy of someone else's choices. Instead, your energy is guided by your own principles. When you cultivate self-respect, it becomes immediately noticeable in the way you communicate and engage with others. You no longer feel compelled to chase attention or interpret silence as mystery. You no longer create elaborate explanations in your mind for someone's lack of effort. Instead, you recognize absence for what it is, a statement of priorities. This recognition allows you to set boundaries without anger or drama. It allows you to pause before sending that extra message, waiting instead to see if your value is reciprocated. Self-respect teaches you that emotional investment should never be one-sided, and that the way people treat you is a reflection of what they choose to give, not a measure of your worth. Self-respect also transforms longing into clarity. When you respect yourself, you're able to differentiate between desire and need, between fantasy and reality. You stop romanticizing distance because you are grounded in the knowledge that consistent care is non-negotiable. Emotional manipulation, unresponsiveness, or silence loses its power over you because you no longer accept inconsistency as a measure of importance. You begin to notice the patterns that you may have overlooked before, and instead of hoping for change, you evaluate whether the connection aligns with your values and your emotional needs. In essence, self-respect acts as a filter, automatically separating relationships that uplift you from those that drain you. Perhaps most importantly, self-respect influences not only how others treat you, but how you treat yourself. When you insist on being valued, your energy shifts. You no longer overextend to fill the gaps left by someone else. You protect your emotional boundaries, and by doing so, you invite a different kind of interaction, one that is conscious, balanced, and mutually respectful. This shift changes the dynamic entirely because people respond to what is accepted and what is tolerated. When emotional neglect is no longer tolerated, distance can no longer be romanticized, and silence can no longer dictate your emotional state. Self-respect quietly but profoundly alters the relational balance, placing power where it belongs. with the person who refuses to diminish their own worth in pursuit of someone else's attention. Furthermore, self-respect creates a sense of independence within attachment. You may still feel drawn to someone, still think about them often, but that longing is no longer desperate or destabilizing. Instead, it exists alongside confidence and composure. Emotional intensity remains, but it is tempered by self-awareness, choice, and boundaries. In this way, self-respect does not diminish care. It transforms care into something healthy. It changes the rules of engagement, ensuring that your heart and energy are not given to someone who does not reciprocate, and that your emotional life is guided by conscious intention rather than unexamined longing. Letting go is often perceived as failure, as giving up, or as the end of something meaningful. But true letting go is not about loss. It is about reclaiming yourself. It is about stepping out of emotional loops that keep you tethered to someone who never truly committed to being present. The difficulty lies not in releasing the person, but in releasing the story you have created around them. You have imagined possibilities, rehearsed conversations, and built a version of the relationship that exists only in your mind. Letting go requires dismantling that imagined world while remaining compassionate toward yourself. It is not an act of anger or denial. It is an act of clarity, an acknowledgement that your emotional energy deserves reciprocation, not speculation. One of the most challenging aspects of letting go is confronting the feelings of longing and disappointment without allowing them to dictate your actions. It is easy to mistake the persistence of desire for evidence of attachment, thinking that strong emotions mean the connection was meaningful or destined. But letting go means recognizing that emotional intensity does not equal value or reciprocity. It requires looking at reality without filters and accepting that absence is itself an answer. No amount of wishing, waiting, or hoping will change the fact that the person has chosen distance. Releasing attachment does not erase the feelings you have. It simply refuses to allow those feelings to control you or define your worth. Letting go also involves reframing the narrative you tell yourself. Instead of seeing the other person as a loss, you begin to see the relationship as a lesson. You understand that being consumed by someone who is unavailable is not a testament to love, but to the need for self-awareness. Every moment of waiting, every replayed memory, every imagined conversation becomes a mirror reflecting your own patterns, desires, and limits. By examining these patterns, you gain insight into what you truly value and what you will no longer tolerate. Letting go, then, is not a concession. It is an evolution of your emotional intelligence. Another key element is allowing yourself to feel fully without resistance. Letting go does not mean suppressing sadness, disappointment, or even longing. It means witnessing these emotions without letting them compel action that would compromise your self-respect. You may feel the urge to call, message, or seek closure, but true release comes when you resist that impulse, understanding that closure does not always come from the other person. It comes from your own willingness to accept reality as it is. In this way, letting go becomes a conscious practice of self-care rather than a reaction to absence. Furthermore, letting go without bitterness requires separating the person from their actions. You do not need to vilify or resent them for not calling or not being emotionally present. Instead, you acknowledge their choices as reflections of who they are, not judgments on your worth. Bitterness arises when we personalize someone else's behavior as a critique of our value. By letting go without anger or blame, you reclaim your emotional sovereignty, freeing yourself from the gravitational pull of resentment while maintaining clarity about your own boundaries and needs. Finally, letting go opens space for growth and new possibilities. Emotional release is not an ending. It is a clearing. It allows you to reconnect with yourself, refocus your attention on relationships that are mutually nurturing, and cultivate an internal sense of completeness that does not rely on external validation. In this space, longing no longer dictates your emotional state, silence no longer carries power over your mind, and attachment is no longer confused with love. You become aware that freedom, clarity, and self-respect are far more valuable than any imagined connection, and that releasing someone who never fully chose you is the first step toward a life where emotional energy is invested wisely, intentionally, and with reciprocity in mind.